The invitation spread through the galaxy like wildfire, a ripple of confusion and intrigue that none of the apex species could ignore. It was absurd, almost offensive in its audacity. The humans, a species barely a blip on the galactic timeline, had extended an invitation to the most dominant predators of known space. Not to war, not to negotiations, but to dinner. For creatures that ruled by tooth and claw, by sheer evolutionary supremacy, the concept was foreign. Predators did not dine together. They competed, they killed, they consumed. Even among their own kind, alliances were fragile, built on uneasy truces rather than true cooperation. And yet, the humans had sent a message not of deference, not of fear, but of hospitality. Many dismissed it as a joke, an elaborate human jest. Others suspected a trap, some kind of ploy to assert dominance or study their weaknesses. But beneath the skepticism, a deep and primal curiosity took root. If there was one thing that united apex predators across species, it was their hunger. Not just for flesh, but for knowledge, for understanding the unknown. And so they came. From the frozen death worlds to the molten heart of volcanic empires, they arrived in their warships and dreadnoughts, docking at the orbital station the humans had designated for the occasion. The station itself was nothing remarkable, efficient, well-maintained, but lacking the ostentation of the older empires. Yet there was something unnerving about the way the humans moved within it, utterly unbothered by the arrival of creatures that had driven civilizations to extinction. The Kordath warlord, Lord Zalvrak, stepped onto the station first, his 6 crimson eyes scanning the halls with predatory precision. His kind had ruled their world through sheer evolutionary ferocity, their mandibles honed for rending flesh, their society built upon endless cycles of dominance and consumption. Beside him, the Volcar queen moved with cold elegance, her reptilian form wrapped in ceremonial battle silk, her every step a reminder of the empires she had devoured. More followed, the prime devourer of the Zyral hive, its chitinous form glistening under the artificial lights. The war beasts of the Karth dominion, their feline frames coiled with raw muscle, their claws sharper than monomolecular blades. Each of them an apex predator in their own right. Each of them accustomed to the scent of fear when they arrived on a foreign world. But the humans were not afraid. Captain Elias Mercer stood at the entrance to the banquet hall, a pleasant, unreadable expression on his face. He was unarmed. That alone was a statement, an insult even. To stand before such creatures with no visible means of defense was either the height of arrogance or the purest madness. And yet, there was something in his posture, in the way he met their gazes without flinching, that gave even the most hardened predators pause. "Welcome," he said, his voice even, almost casual. "Dinner is ready." The banquet hall was unlike anything they had expected. No crude displays of conquest, no grotesque feasts of struggling prey. Instead, it was elegant. Soft lighting, polished obsidian tables, seating arranged with an almost deliberate symmetry. The air was thick with the scent of cooked meat, rich and layered, carrying notes of something none of them could quite place. Zalvrak's mandibles clicked in irritation. "What is this?" Mercer gestured smoothly. "A meal, a carefully prepared, meticulously crafted meal designed specifically for our guests." The predators hesitated. Instinct warred with curiosity. To sit at a table, to dine rather than consume, it was unnatural. Yet the hunger gnawed at them, and the scent of the food was impossible to ignore. One by one, they took their seats, their movements wary but intrigued. Servants, human attendants, unarmed and unafraid, stepped forward, placing plates before each guest. The dishes were varied, tailored to each species. For the carnivores, thick cuts of meat, seared to perfection. For the insectoids, gelatinous compounds that pulsed with unseen energy. Even the omnivores among them found something perfectly suited to their biology. The first bite was taken by the Volcar queen. She moved with the slow deliberation of a being used to assassination attempts, her slit-pupilled eyes never leaving Mercer's face as she lifted a piece of seared flesh to her mouth. She bit down. Then she froze. A ripple of something unreadable passed over her face. Not displeasure, not suspicion, something deeper. Her tongue flicked out, tasting the remnants of the flavor, her pupils dilating. The Kordath warlord followed. His mandibles tore into the meat, expecting something mundane, something lesser. Instead, his 6 eyes widened as the taste ignited something deep within him, something primal. It was beyond sustenance. It was power. Across the table, the reactions were the same, silent, almost stunned. The prime devourer of the Zyral hive clicked its mandibles in rapid succession, a pheromone burst of confusion and something dangerously close to pleasure. The feline huntress of the Karth dominion let out a slow exhale, her claws flexing involuntarily against the table. They had eaten the finest delicacies of their own worlds. They had consumed the flesh of fallen foes, tasted the rarest creatures in the galaxy. But this was something else entirely. One of the smaller predators, a reptilian warlord from a lesser-known empire, suddenly dropped his fork with a clatter. His chest rose and fell in quick, sharp breaths. His gaze snapped to Mercer. What is this?" Mercer took a slow sip of his wine, his expression betraying nothing. "A meal, nothing more." But that was a lie, and they all knew it. The room fell into silence, heavy with realization. The food was too perfect. It was not just tailored to their species, but to them as individuals. Every bite was balanced precisely to their biology, their metabolism, their unique predatory instincts. It was nourishment, but more than that, it was enhancement. The kind of enhancement that took generations of study, of understanding prey and predator alike. The Volker Queen set down her utensil with deliberate care. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of entire conquered worlds. "You have studied us." Mercer nodded. "Of course. You know us better than we know ourselves." Another nod. The predators exchanged glances, silent communications passing between them in the way only apex beings could. A rare and terrible understanding began to form. Humans were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most naturally gifted killers. But they had done something far more dangerous. They had studied. They had observed, dissected, analyzed. They had taken the most powerful creatures in the galaxy and learned everything there was to know, their biology, their instincts, their needs. And then they had done what no other species had ever dared. They had fed them, not as equals, as livestock. A slow dawning horror crept into the room. This was not a diplomatic gesture. This was domestication. A carefully crafted introduction into something older, something deeper than any of them had imagined. Mercer set his glass down with a soft clink. "Tell me," he said, his voice as casual as ever, "have any of you ever heard of animal husbandry?" The doors to the banquet hall locked with a quiet hiss. The lights dimmed just slightly. The apex predators, for the first time in their existence, understood what it meant to be prey. The silence that followed Mercer's words was unlike anything the apex predators had ever experienced. It was not the silence of a stalking hunt, not the quiet before an ambush, or the stillness that came when prey accepted its fate. It was something deeper, something more unsettling, a silence that tasted like realization, like understanding, creeping in too late. The Volker Queen was the first to react, though she did not lash out. Her slit-pupilled eyes narrowed, her clawed fingers flexing slightly against the polished surface of the table. Her kind had ruled the stars through sheer dominance, consuming entire species without ever once fearing retaliation. But this was a game she had not realized she was playing. Zelvrak shifted in his seat, his mandibles twitching. His kind were creatures of war, of blood and bone, built to dominate through brute force. His instinct screamed at him now, telling him that something was deeply fundamentally wrong. And yet, despite every fiber of his being demanding action, he did not move. Because in the deepest parts of his mind, where evolutionary survival instincts had been honed over millions of years, he recognized the truth. This was not a battlefield. This was not a challenge. This was a pen, and they were inside it. The Karth huntress let out a slow, deliberate exhale, her feline tail flicking in agitation. Her kind were used to playing with their food, to toying with lesser beings before the kill, and yet here, now, she felt the weight of something she had never encountered before. Not fear, exactly. Something more dangerous. Control. The humans had controlled this entire interaction from the beginning. Every step had been planned, every variable accounted for. They had studied each species, not in battle, not through war or diplomacy, but through something infinitely more insidious. Through nourishment. Animal husbandry. The prime devourer of the xyral hive chittered, the sound like dry bones scraping together. An ancient practice, common among lesser creatures. We have used it on the worlds we have harvested. Mercer tilted his head slightly, a flicker of amusement crossing his features. Yes, you all have. The implications hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. They had all done it. Every species at this table had, at some point in their evolutionary history, domesticated something, broken a wild thing, bent it to their will, learned its weaknesses, adjusted its environment, controlled its reproduction, optimized it for use. Whether for food, labor, or companionship, the cycle was always the same. A dominant species learned how to control another. And now, in this moment, they all realized what had been done to them. The food had not merely been tailored to their biology. It had been engineered. The balance of proteins, the precise levels of stimulation, the way the flavors activated their most primal instincts. It was not simply the best meal they had ever eaten. It was conditioning. And worse, it had worked. The realization was a slow, creeping horror. No one lunged across the table. No one roared in defiance, because the weight of what this meant was far more terrifying than any open challenge could ever be. The Karth huntress was the first to break the silence, her voice quiet, measured, but edged with something primal. Why? Mercer smiled, his fingers tapping idly against his glass. Because we understand the food chain. Jalvrak's 6 eyes gleamed with something dangerous. You are not above us. Aren't we? Mercer asked, and his tone was not mocking, not condescending. It was calm, confident, certain. The Vokar queen exhaled, her reptilian gaze locked onto the human with something unreadable. Domestication is a slow process. A species does not become livestock overnight. That's true, Mercer agreed. It takes patience, generations of careful adjustments, the right balance of comfort and control. But it starts with a single step, the first cut of meat, the first acceptance of a hand that feeds instead of fights, the first realization that survival is easier when you stop resisting. A quiet ripple of unease passed through the table. Because they had eaten? They had not just tolerated this gathering, they had accepted the food. And worse, they had enjoyed it. The prime devourer clicked its mandibles rapidly, an anxious, irritated sound. This will not work. You cannot break apex predators as you would lesser creatures. We are not cattle. Mercer took another sip of his wine. That's what they all say at first. There was no need to elaborate. They all knew the truth. Every species resists domestication in the beginning. Wild creatures fight, they struggle, they lash out. But given the right circumstances, the right conditioning, they learn, they accept. They evolve into something different, something manageable. The Karth huntress's claws tapped softly against the table. What if we kill you here? Mercer's smile didn't waver. You could try. But tell me, What happens next? No one answered, because they all knew. There were no weapons in this room, but they did not need to see them to know they were there. The humans had planned for every possibility. The station was under their control, the air they breathed carefully regulated. And even if they did escape, what then? They had already eaten the food. They had already taken the first step. A single meal meant nothing, but a second, a third, an addiction to the nourishment provided by their keepers, the slow, creeping dependence on a source of sustenance that was better, more optimized than anything they could create on their own. Domestication did not happen in a moment. It happened over time, and the process had already begun. Zalvrak's hands clenched into fists, his breathing slow and controlled. This is war. Mercer shook his head. No. War is inefficient. War destroys resources. War costs lives. This is something better. The Volcar Queen leaned forward slightly, her scaled fingers tracing the rim of her glass. You intend to control us through food? Through need, Mercer corrected, through understanding, through the slow, inevitable pull of something you will never be able to resist. Because here's the truth. Being at the top of the food chain is exhausting, isn't it? Constantly fighting, constantly killing, constantly watching your back. It takes effort, it takes energy. But what if you didn't have to? The table was silent, because they all understood, deep down, the truth in his words. The constant struggle of dominance, the eternal cycle of predator and prey, was tiring. It was why civilizations crumbled, why empires fell. No species could maintain absolute dominance forever. The Karth huntress's tail flicked sharply. And what do humans gain from this? What do you get? Mercer leaned back, his smile widening just slightly. Loyalty, cooperation, strength, the kind that doesn't come from war, but from something far deeper, something built over time, over trust, over generations. Zalvrak let out a low, rumbling growl. You think we will accept this, that we will simply allow ourselves to be tamed? Mercer's expression didn't change. I think you'll tell yourselves that you won't. I think you'll resist. You'll leave this station, you'll go back to your empires, your clans, your hives. You'll tell yourselves you'll never return. His fingers drummed idly against the table. And then, one day, you'll remember the taste. Silence. Deep, unbroken. Because they all knew he was right. It would start as a curiosity, a lingering craving, a thought at the edges of their minds. And then, one by one, they would return. They would seek out the food again, just once, just to remember. And then again, and again. And by the time they realized what had happened, it would be far, far too late. Mercer stood, adjusting his jacket, his smile never wavering. Dinner is over. You may leave whenever you like. No one will stop you. No chains, no threats, no violence. Just the cold, undeniable reality of what had already begun. One by one, the apex predators rose from their seats. And one by one, they left. But none of them felt like hunters anymore. The return to their ships was silent. No words were spoken, no challenges issued. The apex predators moved through the halls of the human station as though something unseen weighed upon them, their bodies tense in ways they did not fully understand. For the first time in their long and violent histories, they had been made to feel small, not through war, not through overwhelming force, but through something far more insidious. They had been fed. The Volcar Queen's claws twitched as she strode toward her shuttle, her thoughts racing. The taste of the meat still lingered on her tongue, the carefully crafted blend of nutrients and flavors engineered perfectly for her physiology. She had ruled over 1,000 worlds, had consumed the flesh of species that no longer existed, but nothing had ever satisfied her so completely. That was the problem. It had not simply been a meal, it had been a hook. Inside her ship, she activated the secure channels, calling upon her personal researchers. "Analyze everything in my system," she ordered, her voice sharper than it had been in years. "The food, the air, the water, I want to know what they did." Her second in command, a battle-scarred warlord named Corthel, inclined his head. "You believe they poisoned us?" The Queen hesitated. That would have been the logical conclusion. A biological agent, a hidden toxin, something that would ensure control. And yet, she could feel no sickness, no dulling of her mind, no weakness in her limbs. If anything, she felt stronger, her senses sharper, her reflexes honed. It was as if the food had not only sated her, but optimized her. That was what made it so dangerous. "Not poison," she said slowly. "Something worse." Corthel did not question further. He knew better than to doubt her instincts. The Volcar did not conquer by ignorance. They survived because they understood when they had been outmaneuvered. And they had been. On another warship, Zalvarak sat in the dark, his massive frame hunched over as he stared at his own hands. His kind were creatures of brute strength, honed by millennia of bloodshed. They did not need strategy. They did not need deception. They were war given form. And yet the humans had played them. His mandibles clicked softly. A slow, creeping dread coiled in his gut. What disturbed him most was not the realization that they had been manipulated. It was the realization that he wanted more. The meal had been more than sustenance. It had been perfection. Every bite had been calculated to fuel his body in ways he had never experienced. He felt better than he had in years. He could feel the subtle changes in his body. Improved muscle efficiency, heightened awareness, a strange but undeniable sense of balance. He had fought entire wars, bathed in the blood of countless enemies, and never before had he eaten something that made him stronger. The humans knew. That was the true horror. They had not just studied his kind, they had improved them. He clenched his fists, his claws digging into the reinforced metal of his chair. He should be furious. He should be planning retaliation. But the cold truth gnawed at him, undeniable and unrelenting. The humans had offered something his species had never considered possible. A world without struggle. A world where survival was not a battle, where dominance did not come with exhaustion. A world where his kind could be more than just killers. His own thoughts repulsed him, and yet he could not deny them. On the Karth Dominion vessel, the feline huntress paced restlessly. Her kind had always understood the slow game of control. They had been the patient stalkers, the ones who let prey run until exhaustion set in, until the chase became unwinnable. And now, for the first time, they were the prey. She bared her fangs, her tail lashing against the walls of her chamber. The humans had set the trap before they had even realized they were being hunted. The food had not been a weapon, it had been an invitation. And the worst part? They had accepted. Her claws raked against the control panel, sending messages across her fleet. No one was to return to the humans, not for trade, not for talks, not for anything. She would not be caged. But as she stormed through her ship, her body hummed with energy. The meal had changed something deep inside her, something primal. She could feel it in her muscles, in the way her vision had sharpened. And despite every ounce of logic screaming at her to resist, she craved more. Time passed. Days turned into weeks. Across the empires of the apex predators, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Leaders who had once ruled with absolute dominance found themselves distracted. There were no signs of human interference, no threats, no ultimatums. Only the quiet, insidious hunger that refused to fade. It was not a starvation of the body. They were well fed, their species thriving, but nothing tasted the same. the most exquisite feasts of their homeworlds, the rarest of hunted prey, everything had lost its flavor. The perfection of that single human meal had tainted them. They could not go back to what they once were, and the humans knew it. They had known before the dinner even began. On a distant colony world hidden deep within human-controlled space, Mercer sat in a dimly lit chamber, watching streams of data flow across the screens before him. Reports from various intelligence networks, subspace transmissions, psychological assessments. Everything was going exactly as planned. The predators would resist. That was inevitable. It was in their nature. But nature could be changed. It was never about direct control, it was about dependence. Apex predators were only powerful because they had never known anything else. They had spent their entire existences at the top, never once considering that they could be something different. Something better. The process had begun. The first whispers of curiosity, of temptation, of need. They would hold out as long as they could, fight against it with all their strength. But hunger was patient. Mercer tapped a command, sending a new directive to human diplomats across the galaxy. A simple, unassuming message. A reminder. The doors were still open. The dinner table was still waiting. And the next meal would be even better. He leaned back, exhaling softly as he gazed out at the stars. Domestication was a slow process, but once it started, it was inevitable. The tension within the apex empires had reached a breaking point. The ruling classes of each species had worked tirelessly to suppress the creeping influence of that one night, that one meal, that single insidious moment when humanity had upended the very nature of the food chain. They had outlawed human cuisine, imposed restrictions on trade, and executed those who sought out human stations in secret. But it did not matter, because the hunger had already taken root. On the Volcar homeworld, the queen sat upon her throne of bone and steel, her slit puppet eyes scanning the reports before her. Her spies had done their work well, and yet the results filled her with unease. Consumption habits have changed, productivity has decreased, hunting yields are at an all-time low. She had tried everything. She had ordered feasts of the most exotic meats in the galaxy, had demanded her finest geneticists refine the breeding of livestock, had even considered introducing new species to their agricultural systems to diversify their diet. Nothing worked. She had tried the meats herself, had torn into them with a hunger that should have been all-consuming. But every bite, every mouthful was dull, bland, lacking. Her claws tightened against the throne's armrest. Her people were suffering, not from disease, not from famine, not from war, from something much worse. The realization of what could be. The Zural hive was no better. The prime devourer sat deep within the tangled labyrinth of the hive nexus, surrounded by its vast, writhing network of drones. The hive was eternal, bound together by instinct and genetic memory, a perfect system that had outlived the rise and fall of countless civilizations. And yet it was changing. The drones were restless, unfocused. The hunting parties brought back less and less, their efficiency dropping despite optimal conditions. The hive had no need for morale, no need for indulgence. It was a system that had functioned without failure for millennia, but had tasted the difference. The human meal had been more than sustenance. It had been a recalibration, a redefinition of what optimal truly meant. And now the hive craves something it could not synthesize, something it could not replicate. The perfect balance. The Karth Dominion had been the first to issue death sentences for any of their kind who sought out human cuisine. The hunt mistress herself had declared it a weakness, an affront to their proud carnivorous lineage. And yet, in the dead of night, she had sent her most trusted agents into human space. They had not returned. Not because they had been captured, because they had not wanted to. She could feel it, a gnawing need beneath her skin, an agitation in her muscles. She was not weak, she was a predator, honed by generations of unrelenting evolution. But what if there was another way? The thought was poison, and yet she could not kill it. The galaxy remained in uneasy silence, each of the apex species wrestling with a war they could not fight in open battle. They had won every war they had ever fought, crushed every civilization that had ever stood against them, dominated every world they had touched. But this was not war. This was conditioning, and the humans were patient. They did not press, did not provoke. They simply waited. And then the first fractures appeared. It started with the smaller factions, splinter groups within the great apex empires, who had less to lose, who had less pride to protect. A rogue Vulcar warband, seeking out human trade routes under the guise of a skirmish. A Zyral splinter hive that mysteriously cut itself off from the main network and vanished into deep space. A Karth mercenary pack that refused a lucrative contract in favor of a long-range mission toward neutral territories. Each of them with the same destination. Each of them chasing the same hunger. The reports flooded in. More and more disappeared, more and more defected. Not with weapons, not with stolen data or ships. With empty stomachs. The Vulcar Queen crushed the data tablet in her grip, her breath hissing between her fangs. It is happening faster than I expected. Xalvrak watched his most trusted warriors grow distant, their loyalty fraying with each passing day. They have already lost the war in their hearts. The Karth huntmistress felt her own resolve weaken, felt her own thoughts betray her. If even I feel it, how long before the others break? And then the humans extended the invitation. It was subtle. A simple transmission sent across secure diplomatic channels. Not a demand, not an ultimatum. An offer. A banquet, open to any who wished to attend. No weapons, no negotiations. Just a meal. A second step. And they all knew deep down they would take it. They would come with their justifications, their careful lies. It was reconnaissance, it was intelligence gathering, it was merely an effort to understand their enemy. But it was none of those things. It was surrender. The next dinner was larger, more attended. The apex predators sat at the table once more, their bodies tense, their minds clouded with the knowledge of what was happening. And then the food was served. There was no fight. No words. They ate, and the humans smiled, because they knew the process was already complete. The apex predators had long held the galaxy in their claws, each one of them the undisputed sovereign of their respective dominions. For millennia they had thrived through might, cunning, and sheer ruthlessness. But now, something insidious was happening beneath the surface. Something that none of them had anticipated, not even in their darkest hours. The shift was gradual, like a wave building beneath a calm ocean, but it was undeniable. Mercer sat quietly in his private quarters aboard the human station, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against the desk in front of him. Across the room, a holographic display flickered with data, every transmission from the apex predators now flowing directly to him. The reports, the subtle shifts in their behaviors, the unease creeping into their military strategies. It was all there. He had expected resistance, but this was different. The slow unraveling of their pride, their traditions, and their identities was not something he had prepared for. It was something far more complex, far more difficult to manage than he had anticipated. He smiled to himself, the quiet satisfaction of the moment settling in his chest. They had resisted, yes, but resistance had never been the true goal. The goal had always been patience. The patience to make them realize that the fight for dominance was not what it seemed. They had tasted the food. They had consumed the product of humanity's care, of their careful engineering, and it had changed them. Not in the way they would have expected, not in the way they could have foreseen. It had made them question everything about what it meant to be an apex predator. It had made them feel unfulfilled. And that was the key to their eventual submission. Not force, not violence, but unmet hunger, a craving that they could never fully satisfy, a hole in their very being that they could never fill with their old ways. Mercer knew this was only the beginning. The apex predators were not so easily broken. They would not simply bow down to human rule. But what mattered was that they were already starting to change, to see the world from a new perspective. And that was the most dangerous shift of all. It had started subtly at first, small, almost imperceptible signs that suggested the apex predators were beginning to question themselves. The Volcar, once the most fearsome and respected of them all, had begun to show signs of hesitation. Their war parties were less frequent, less aggressive. The Queen, whose iron will had always guided them, had ordered several internal investigations into the decline of their hunting practices, but every answer brought more questions. The hunting grounds were still plentiful, the prey was still abundant, yet the Volcar no longer relished the kill. There was something missing. The Zyal hive, known for its relentless hunger and insatiable appetite for conquest, was even worse off. The prime devourer, who had once overseen the destruction of entire civilizations, now found itself at the mercy of its own drones. The hive, once a well-oiled machine of cold, calculating efficiency, had become sluggish, unfocused. The drones, driven by their genetic programming, now hesitated before each kill. Some refused to hunt at all, and others sought out human stations, taking orders from the humans instead of the hive. The drones were not disobedient. They were simply changed. They had tasted the food and now they couldn't stop craving it. The thought of food as a tool for survival was replaced by a much more unsettling reality. The idea that food could change them, shape them in ways they never thought possible. The prime devourer found itself utterly perplexed, unable to comprehend the rebellion brewing within its own hive. The Karth Dominion, famed for its patience and cunning, had long relied on its huntress instinct to guide them. Their people were the most disciplined, the most tactical of all the apex species. But even they could not ignore the pull of the human meal. It had been subtle at first, a fleeting craving, but it had quickly grown into something more dangerous. The hunt mistress, who had led her people to countless victories, now found herself unable to focus. The hunts became less fulfilling, the thrill of the chase dulled by the memories of a meal that was better. The Karth had long relied on their ability to outlast and outthink their prey, but now they were unsure of themselves. The meal had unlocked something within them, a longing for something more. They didn't want to just conquer anymore, they wanted to experience. The ripple effect was not confined to the ruling classes. The soldiers, the warriors, the hunters, they were all affected. The notion that they were the ultimate predators, the undisputed rulers of the stars, began to erode. And with that erosion came doubt. The apex species were not used to doubt. It had never been a part of their lexicon. But now it festered in their minds, gnawing at their pride, their history, their very sense of self. And the more they resisted, the more it fed on them. Mercer knew this would take time for the full extent of the change to take hold. But in his heart, he could already see the transformation. This was not just about food, it was about something much deeper. The apex predators were being made to face the harsh reality that their reign had never been as secure as they had believed. They were vulnerable, just like any other species, just like any other being that had ever existed. And now they had tasted the possibility of something different. It wasn't about dominance anymore. It wasn't about conquest or survival. It was about need. And that need would shape the future of the galaxy in ways no one could predict. Months passed, and the apex predators continued their internal struggles. The humans, however, did not sit idle. They watched, waited, and, most importantly, listened. Diplomats moved through the galaxy, quietly setting the stage for what was to come. The meal had opened a door, but it was just the beginning. The next step was far more subtle. On the Karth homeworld, a fleet of human ships arrived at the diplomatic port, their sleek forms gliding gracefully into the dock. The Karth hunt mistress had agreed to meet with the humans, though she did so reluctantly. Her people had seen the invitation to a peace summit as nothing more than a chance to discuss the terms of the growing food crisis. But when the hunt mistress entered the chamber where the humans awaited her, she was not met with the coldness she had expected. Instead, she was greeted with a feast. The humans had prepared a banquet far more than a mere offering. It was an experience carefully curated to cater to the finest tastes of her species. The scents wafted through the room, drawing her in like a moth to the flame. Her instincts screamed at her to reject it, to turn away, to remember the strength of her ancestors. But as the first bite touched her tongue, a wave of pleasure washed over her, and the walls she had built began to crumble. Her mind rebelled. Her pride refused to acknowledge the truth. She had wanted it. It was not the food that had defeated her, but the reality that she had succumbed to it. The same story played out across the stars. The Volker Queen sat alone in her chambers, reflecting on the meal she had eaten just days before. She had told herself it was a one-time indulgence, that she could control it, that it would not affect her people. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Her warriors, her people, had changed. They had become softer, more receptive. They no longer hunted with the same intensity, and her own mind wandered back to the dinner. The flavor, the texture, the way it had filled her body with energy and warmth. The Zyro hive had become fragmented, with drones defecting at an alarming rate. They no longer adhered to the hive's cold efficiency. They were seeking something they could not name, but which they had tasted in the food, in the quiet moments when the hive would rest. The drones wanted to belong. They wanted something more than endless consumption. And the humans, as always, were there to offer it. Mercer had watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. The time had come. The invitation was no longer needed. The apex predators would come to them willingly now, drawn in by the need they could no longer deny. There was no more war. There was no more bloodshed. Just a slow, inevitable submission to the reality of their new existence. The food had never been the weapon. The meal had never been the trap. It had only been the first step. A step that would lead them all down a path from which there would be no return.